Hi, I'm Dillon, and you're listening to the Animals at Home podcast. Hello, welcome back to another episode. Thank you very much for listening to today's show. Today I am joined by Dr. Jen Moore. Dr. Moore is an associate professor in the biology department at Grand Valley University in Michigan. Her research mainly focuses on conservation, and most of her research does focus on reptile and amphibian species. This is one of those episodes where you're going to get one of two things out of it. One, if you are someone who is a little bit younger and you're still trying to figure out what to do with your life and you're trying to figure out if maybe you want to go into academics, this is a great place to start. Dr. Moore gives a ton of different advice and really lets us know about some amazing experiences she's had in her academic career. And I know if I was a young kid and I heard stories that you're about to listen to, it would really motivate you to get into this field of research. She talks about the research she's done in the Galapagos and New Zealand and Alaska, and it's really, really, truly amazing to listen to. And the second thing it might do is maybe you're like me and your school days are behind you, but you're just a hobbyist and a herper, but you still really want to contribute to conservation in some way. Dr. Moore gives some really great advice on how we can do that and certain things that we can apply in our daily lives that will allow us to help contribute and help even help the academics. Even though we're not involved in the academics specifically, there are things that you and I can do to help them along, which in the end of the day is going to help the population of animals on the planet, and you and I both know that's what we want. For any information on today's show, make sure you visit the show notes at www.animalsathome.ca/podcast. Just click on this episode and you'll find any of the information that you need for the show, and you can also learn about 3 or 4 different ways that you can help support the show. All of that is at animalsathome.ca/podcast. Enjoy the show. All right. Well, Jen, thank you very much for joining me today. I really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm in the early stages of this podcast, and I'm trying to get guests from different sort of walks of life. So having an academic on is great. So we can, I think we can always learn a lot from you guys that are doing the research.
Yeah. I hope you can.
We'll see. I think you'll have lots of information to share. So can you give us a little bit of a background, just sort of a brief history of your education as well as where you're working right now?
Sure. So I am currently an associate professor in the biology department at Grand Valley State University, which is in West Michigan, which is where I'm from also. And I am a conservation biologist, and I work primarily with reptiles and sometimes with amphibians, but I've also done work with mammals and the occasional bird as well. I was born and raised in Michigan, so I did most of my training here. I went to northern Michigan, way up in the Upper Peninsula for my bachelor's degree, and then I came a little bit further south and I went to Central Michigan University for a master's degree. And that was where I guess I've always just been totally obsessed with reptiles, like from day one. But that was really where I just started delving more into research. And that was where I started working with Eastern Massasauga rattlesnakes, which I'm sure I'll talk about quite a bit. That's one of my main species that I focus on nowadays. And then I had this fantastic opportunity for my PhD to go to New Zealand. And I studied at Victoria University of Wellington. And I was fortunate enough to fall into this project working with tuatara, which, as I'm sure your listeners will know, is a pretty fascinating reptile that they don't fall in with lizards and snakes, even though they look like lizards. They're in their own order of reptiles. So there's 4 groups of 4 orders of reptiles, and tuatara are in their own group. And then there's snakes and lizards and crocs and turtles. So crocs and gators and turtles. So they're a pretty unique species. And I was lucky enough to do some pretty fantastic field work when I was in New Zealand. And then from there, I actually, oddly enough, went up to Alaska, to the University of Alaska Southeast, and I did a postdoctoral research fellowship there, working with boreal toads. I was one of the few people in Alaska doing research on amphibian. Alaska's not known for its reptile and amphibian.
No, definitely not.
So that was pretty interesting. Most folks up there are working on bears or salmon or something,
Right.
iconic species, and there I was working with these toads. But that was a really neat opportunity as well. And then I came back to Michigan, and I worked at Michigan State University for a while as a postdoctoral researcher there. And then I got my job here at Grand Valley. So I did a sort of a boomerang thing, went out and saw the world, and then came back to Michigan.
So growing up in Michigan, Michigan has some decent serious winters. I'm from Canada, so I can't say it's a serious winter, but totally. I have to deal with these horrible winters. But Michigan does get cold, and you guys get snow, so you're not interacting necessarily with reptiles in the wild all the time. So as a child, were you destined to become a biologist, do you think, or did this come up?
Yeah. I mean, when I was a kid, I was the little kid that was just out running around in the streams and, catching handfuls of water snakes. I mean, I've got this picture of my brother and I when we were little kids, just holding, fistfuls of water snakes that you get around here, in some of these coastal areas. You just get these massive piles of water snakes. And that was me as a kid. And then, I was just totally enamored with reptiles. We had a reticulated python when we were kids, and a Nile monitor, and, geckos and pythons and all sorts of pets when we were kids that my parents were really tolerant of, I guess. And then, I guess at some point as an undergrad in college, I just realized that, you can make a career out of this. And that it just sort of took off from there. And then I guess in grad school, I just really got interested in research and teaching and education. And that's how I ended up where I am now, I guess.
Was there something specifically that pushed you into the conservation side? Because I know obviously conservation is one of your biggest focuses on your research, and you have that on your Twitter bio as a conservationist, just separate even from a biologist. So was there an experience that you had or something that really pushed you that way?
Well, I think, when you start working with reptiles and amphibians, you quickly learn that these species are not doing well globally. It's almost impossible to get involved with those species in terms of research and management without recognizing that they are not doing well. There was a paper that just came out recently that, basically said that 60 to 65% of turtle species are either extinct or in absolute peril. So, for me, that's what I'm most interested in is doing research that will help these guys and help somehow with conservation and management. And that's where really the focus of my research is.
So you as a biologist, you definitely have one of those, I would say, dream jobs. As someone who has
for sure,
who's obsessed with animals as a kid, like you have like your list: zookeeper, biologist, or vet.
Yes.
So those are the three like big ones. If you had one word or something that you wish you knew before going down that path, for anyone that would be thinking about going down that path, do you have any advice or words of wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I started out. Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. Those are the three things that people think of when you talk about working with animals. And I was pre-vet for a while, same deal. And then I thought, oh, maybe I could work at a zoo, same deal. And then I don't know, at some point I just realized that being in academia was an option. I guess my advice would just be to talk to people that are working in this field as much as you can, and sometimes it means volunteering your time, right? So you might have to volunteer somewhere and help out in a project and chat with people that way. But just get as much experience as you can, even if it means volunteering, which kind of stinks because you're not getting paid necessarily. But I think most of us that are in this world didn't get into it for the money. So
no.
So there's something to be said for a great quality of life and being really happy with what you do every day and feeling like you are potentially making a difference in the world, even if it's in a small way. I'm not curing cancer, but I might be contributing to the recovery of an endangered species, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly. And I think anybody that is obsessed with animals, they're happy to volunteer their time just to work with something, even if they're data entry or something. It's yes. More exciting. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yep, you got it. And you never know. I mean, I I have been very fortunate in my career to fall into these networks of fantastic people, and just, those opportunities just have presented themselves. And I think you just have to be ready to grab those opportunities when they present themselves and establish that network, I guess, of folks that are working in these fields.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I just wanted to jump back one thing. You were saying that you had that giant pet collection as a kid. Do you have any pets right now, or do you just, I mean, I'm sure you have a lab full of animals that you work with.
Yeah, I don't, I have two dogs. I have an aquarium full of fish. And then I personally only have one reptile pet at this point. And it's a turtle that one of my undergrad students brought to my office a few years ago. It's kind of funny. There were two of them. Unfortunately, one died, but she evidently found, she was at a frat party, and there were these two little turtles that apparently somebody had brought back from a pet store in Florida, and they were tiny, which I there's a reason why you legally aren't supposed to sell turtles under a certain size. And so these guys were tiny little hatchlings, some slider species that I'm not exactly sure what they are, but and so I felt bad for these little turtles, and so I took them home, and the one already had a respiratory infection, and so it didn't make it, but the second one is doing quite well. So
So now you have a pet turtle.
Yeah, so we've got a pet turtle, but I've moving around the world has caused me to have to give away a lot of pets in the past, and so it's just tough for me to keep things anymore. But
Yeah, and those turtles, it's rough for those turtles. Like you said, they're so small. Everyone thinks they're so cute and little,
yes,
and you put it in a 10-gallon fish tank, and none of them stay small.
you got that right. Yeah, even if and that's getting them over that hurdle of being so small too. I mean, you got to. I don't know. They're pretty fragile at that.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
point, so yeah.
Do you know, or do you have an idea of where that passion for animals comes from? Because it's one of those things that everybody or anybody that's involved has it. No one knows where it comes from, I think.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things I'm trying to track down if I can when I talk to everybody about this, because one of the things that I see that happens all the time is you kind of have the academics and the conservationists, and then you have the hobbyists, which are sort of two different groups. And a lot of times those two groups butt heads, and sometimes they're seen as sort of counterintuitive. And, the hobbyists sometimes see the academics as an inconvenience almost, because the academics are telling them this is how you should actually care for an animal, or you shouldn't be wild catching animals or crossbreeding species and things along those lines. But on the other side, the academics actually do the dirty work. You guys are the ones out in the field. And I'm almost pretty sure we would not have animals in the pet trade if we had not academics been studying them. And then on the other side, the hobbyists are sort of this wealth of, people who are passionate about animals, and they probably make the earliest impact on kids. Those are the ones that are going to inspire kids to start looking into animals rather than academic research. So I think there's actually a connection between these groups that is it's big, but I just don't exactly know where it comes from.
Yeah, this is a super interesting question. I think, it's like we all have, I don't know where this fascination with animals comes from either. But it runs deep.
It does.
I've thought about that. And my brother is a biologist as well. So we both have this obsession with reptiles, and I don't know where that came from. I don't know if it was something that, we were certainly outside a lot as kids. We were in nature a lot. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to, end up just loving animals and trying to make a career out of that. So I'm not sure where it comes from. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't think anybody knows.
No, it is. But it definitely is something that's really deep seated and ingrained in folks. And I know there's a lot of reptile lovers out there, really passionate people. And I've had a lot of them in classes and stuff, but I do agree with you that I think there could be more coordination between, there are a lot of efforts out now that, we call them citizen science efforts, where people are, herp hobbyists and herpers are out, collecting data that can cross over and be used. You see this with databases like iNaturalist, or there's Herp Mapper, where folks are out in the field and you see something and you can put it in this database, and then we can use that data to study patterns and trends and distributions and stuff like that. And that is I think just an awesome crossover, because often, it's not the academics who are necessarily out in the field seeing this stuff first. It's you guys, it's the animal lovers. So I do think it's super important that the lines of communication are open there, and that people are willing to cross over.
Yeah, totally.
that it's not animosity, that it's a relationship. So
definitely. And I love the idea of those herp mapper type applications that allow people to go out and participate, because not everybody has the opportunity to go to school, and not everybody wants to go to school, but you can still contribute in a pretty positive way. And you're right. It's a lot of times the hobbyists are the ones that, I had read this quote before that I think it was something along the lines of the scientists discover what the hobbyists already know. So when it comes to like breeding, for example, hobbyists become super good at breeding, and they discover how to do it, and then the science, it kind of follows after. So I definitely think communicating between those two is an awesome thing that we should try to do anyway.
For sure.
So let's talk a little bit about the research that you're doing. So I think you on your website you have, at least on that research page, you have sort of three main tiers. About can you kind of discuss specifically what research you're going after?
Sure. So I guess in terms of where I focus my research, taxonomically, I tend again to focus on reptiles and amphibians, but I do work on other wildlife as well. I am always interested in addressing questions that are useful for conservation and management of threatened and endangered species. And that often takes the form, for my projects anyway, of things that answer sometimes really basic questions about the natural history of the animals, things that we just don't know, which for some of these species, that snakes, for instance, they're hard to detect, right? We don't see them very often. And so there's basic things that we don't know, like how big are the populations? It's pretty basic question. How many animals are out there on the landscape? And so we answer questions like that. We also use things like radio telemetry quite a bit to study, where these animals are going and how they're using landscapes. And, as these landscapes become more complex and they are encountering different types of habitats that they didn't before, maybe developments and suburbia and urban landscapes even. So we do that quite a bit. And then the other tools that I often use are molecular tools. So at some point I realized that there's a whole lot of questions that you can answer by looking at an animal's DNA, which is easier in some ways than, doing something like market capture, where you're capturing these things over and over again. And there's just a whole lot of effort that goes into that. So I like to use molecular tools to answer some of those questions as well. And so, and then I'm also just really interested in studying the genetics of populations, because I think over the long term, that's really important for the long-term persistence of populations. We're all familiar with the concept of inbreeding. That becomes an issue with these small and isolated populations, which for amphibians and reptiles, that's often what we're dealing with. So that's kind of where my projects lie. And so I get to go out in the field quite a bit to some pretty cool places. And then I'm in the lab quite a bit as well. So
right. Yeah. So I know that you kind of had this the snake fungal disease that you guys are really focusing on. Too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you describe a little bit what that is about?
For sure. Yeah. So snake fungal disease is this new emerging disease. Well, maybe it's not necessarily emerging now. Current research is showing us that it's maybe been around since the early 2000s in the US anyway. It's a fungal disease that affects the skin and then can go deeper into the muscle of snakes. It's been detected now in something like 30 to 40 different species and 8 to 10 different snake families. So it seems to be affecting lots of different species. It's not specific to any group. And there was a study that looked at the vulnerability of different groups of snakes, and they didn't find any differences, that they're all sort of equally vulnerable to this. It is a fungus that loves keratin. So not unlike, nail fungus or any of those fungi that tend to plague animals that have keratin on the outsides of their body, which
there's lots of us.
Pretty much all of us do.
Yeah.
And so, you've probably heard of chytrid fungus in amphibians. That's another one that's made a huge impact in wild populations. White nose syndrome in bats, another fungal. So these fungal infections are becoming much more popular, much more common, not popular, among wildlife populations. And so in snakes, it causes various things, but most often in bad cases, you see these lesions on their faces. And I think that's just because that's how they move through their environment, is face first. And so they're picking this stuff up most likely in the soil, and then it attacks the skin on the face. And you can get these big lesions, and it can cause blindness. It messes with their ability to eat. So it can fill the mouth basically with these granulomas and lesions. And then in some species, it can lead to death via other things. So sometimes they'll die from pneumonia or some other thing that attacks them because their immunity is low. But in certain species, it has had a pretty high mortality. So these little rattlesnakes, Massasauga rattlesnakes that I work on, we've found snake fungal disease in Michigan populations a few years back. And so it was sort of like, oh, great, it's here. Now what do we do about it? It seems to have pretty high mortality in Massasaugas, I think just because they're small. And we often find it in bad cases on their faces, of course, and it tends to affect their heat pits. So that's not good if you're that's how you that's how you navigate and you find food and such. So that's not a good thing. But in other species, it seems to not have as huge of an impact in terms of mortality. So timber rattlesnakes, for instance, can get it and then they can clear it in the wild. So we've seen cases where they've been able to just sort of shed it off, and then it heals underneath. So, but it's really a complicated thing because we don't really necessarily understand where it came from. It's not spreading through the country like white nose syndrome has in bats, where it's moving basically it was introduced in the east and it's moving west. The cases of snake fungal disease have been much more random than that. So that you'll see it in Illinois, and then it's reported in Michigan, and then it's reported in Louisiana or Florida or Massachusetts. So the spread has not been predictable, and we weren't even sure if it was something that's been around for longer than we think. So there was a study that looked at museum specimens in Illinois and showed that as far back as the year, I think it was 2000, they detected specimens with these fungal lesions. And so it's been around for a while, but it hasn't been around for that long. And so we're not sure where it came from and really what's going on. So there's a lot of questions surrounding this disease still.
So you can't find where else it's growing or can you find samples of it in the soil fairly easily?
Yeah. So people are working on that. We do know that so people have raised it in the lab, grown it in the lab, and shown that it can grow on lots of things. So it can grow in the soil. It can grow on dead stuff. So it's likely that it's in the environment. But people are looking at that, trying to actually detect the fungus in the environment and where it's living. But it's highly likely that it is in their environment. It's probably a soil. It's in the soil.
And it seems to only really be showing up on the snakes. Like there's no other wildlife in that population or in that area it's growing on.
Nope, not that we know of. Nope, it seems to be specific to the snakes, and it's complicated too because you can have a snake that carries it but isn't showing any signs of the disease. So you can test for it on the skin, or you can have snakes that have it and that they're really, they're very pathogenic. So they're showing, they're in sort of in the advanced stages of this. So we don't know what's different really yet about the ones that are carrying it and the ones that aren't pathogenic yet, or maybe they never will be.
Because that seems unusual for a fungus, right? That would be a kind of just have like almost an incubation period or something, or not. That's strange.
Yeah, I mean, things happen more slowly in reptiles just because of their metabolism. So it's possible that the response is just slower to the infection, and maybe we're just not, we catch it early and it's before the snake has actually developed signs of the disease. But the challenge with this disease is that there isn't going, even if we can figure out where it is in the environment, there's not going to be really a good way to treat it, right? So that's really, to me, that's the challenge. So what we need to do is figure out, we can treat individual cases. A snake that comes, you find a sick snake in the wild, you can bring it in. There's been some luck with nebulizing these antifungal treatments. So you create a gas cloud basically of these antifungals, and you can treat snakes that way. But on a broad scale, that's totally unrealistic, actually out in the wild. So what we really need, I think, to understand is, are there other stressors that these animals are just really being affected by that's causing them to be susceptible to this disease now? And can we mitigate those stressors, to set these guys up to be able to handle these pathogens as they come along? And so that's kind of what I'm interested in, is trying to figure out what's stressing these populations out.
Yes, because it could be just the case that this has been around forever and they've been able to handle it for the beginning of time, and now something has changed where they're not able to handle it anymore.
Yeah. Yep. And we know that, right? We know wildlife are exposed to all sorts of things that they weren't before. Their habitat loss and small and isolated populations, and there's other contaminants in the environment, and just a laundry list of things. And so it's possible that these snakes are now just more susceptible to pathogens than they were before, just because their immunity is lower. They can't deal with them the way they may have been able to in the past.
Because you've also done some work with the Massasauga rattlesnake in terms of looking at how climate change, I think, is affecting the population.
Yeah, we haven't necessarily done any direct climate change research, but there have been some studies that have looked at the vulnerability of these populations to climate change, and have shown that they are fairly vulnerable to climate change. Any species that has relatively low mobility, like a rattlesnake, or like a small rattlesnake, like a Massasauga, very high habitat specificity. So Massasaugas live in wetlands, which is very strange for a rattlesnake, but those habitats are also really limited on the landscape. So any species like that is going to be pretty vulnerable to any changes in its local environment. And so over time, what do you do if you're wildlife facing major climate change? Well, you either adapt or you move, right? Well, we know these guys aren't that prone to move. And even if they were, they don't necessarily have habitats to move into. And so they are probably, and being reptiles, of course, any changes in temperature in their thermal environment, that's going to really have a huge impact. So they're probably pretty vulnerable to potential changes in climate. So that could be a contributing factor. Who knows?
Yeah. So what is it like working with the Massasauga rattlesnake? I almost know nothing about them. Are they fairly aggressive when you catch them? Because they're not that big, right?
No, they're small. They're only like 2 or 3 feet long. They're actually surprisingly docile. They sound like a bee buzzing when they rattle, which is really not very threatening. And they're pretty darn docile. We've never, knock on wood, I've been working with these guys, for 15 years or so, and knock on wood, we've never had anybody get bitten. We're extremely safe. I hope that continues. But yeah, they're really pretty docile. They'd rather get out of your way than anything. And half the time they don't even rattle when you're standing right next to them. So
what is the impact of a bite from one? I guess it's a hemotoxin. It's just probably lots of pain.
Yeah, we actually had a couple of cases of Massasauga bites in Michigan just over the last couple of weeks that I read about in the news. Yeah, you'd have localized swelling and some tissue damage probably. If it's, most folks that are bitten are, if they're taken to a hospital, they're given antivenom. But yeah, it's a cocktail of hemotoxins and cytotoxins. So you'd have cell damage and some, and some hemorrhaging, but you'd live, I'm
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. And are they fairly difficult to find, or where they have a very specific environmental niche?
Yeah, they do. Yeah. So they tend to like very specific types of wetlands. So they like wet prairies, they like fens, they like bogs, which are not super common across most landscapes anymore. We used to have a lot of those, but those are the things that often get filled in for agriculture. So they've lost a lot of habitat across their range, especially in some states, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. The big agricultural areas, which is where these guys used to be common, and they're not anymore. So
right. And then I saw that the latest research that you were working on, although the paper's not available, I think you guys haven't quite published it yet, was the neonate box turtles looking at prescribed burning.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that was a cool project. One of my grad students led that up. Yeah, so we work up in northern Michigan with the U.S. Forest Service, where they manage a huge the national forest is up there, and box turtles are one of they call them their forester sensitive species. So basically a species that if there's any forestry that's done, they pay attention to it. And they maintain some of those open canopy habitats up there with prescribed burning, right? So they'll set a fire and that sets back tree growth and woody vegetation growth, basically. And so those are coincidentally also habitats that box turtles use for nesting in this largely closed canopy forest. They tend to move out into these little openings and lay their eggs. And so the question was, what happens to those little hatchlings when they come out of those nests a few months later? And are we just basically burning them up through these prescribed burns? And this is always an issue with reptile management and fire. There's this sort of
that's an interesting combination. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's like we know that reptiles and fire don't mix well, but by the same token, if we don't use tools like prescribed burning to maintain these open habitats, which they need obviously for various things, then they lose their ability to do things like nest or thermoregulate. So anyway, we we tracked a bunch of female box turtles and protected their nests, and then put little tiny radio transmitters on the hatchlings when they came out of the nest for the first. Well, the goal was to track them through their first year of life, but we didn't get any that we were able to keep track of through the first year of life. So it turns out little baby box turtles, I like to call them the Oreos of the forest. They're sort of they're crunchy on the outside and soft in the middle. They get eaten by all sorts of things. They occasionally get run over by cars, even in areas where we didn't have a lot of traffic. And they largely stay in those openings for the first at least 6 months of life, which means if you're burning in the fall, when those little guys are coming out, you're going to just torch that whole group of hatchlings.
So is that mostly what happened to the hatchlings, is they actually got burnt up?
No, the Forest Service thankfully stopped burning while we were doing this study, just so that we could figure out where these guys were.
Gotcha.
And then we were able to go back to them and say, well, look, within that first fall, you're going to have a cohort of hatchlings that's probably still either in or very close to those openings. And so we were able to give them some advice on the timing of those burns, and then how to mitigate, the fact that the hatchlings were in there. Still.
But the neonates actually didn't make it beyond the year, just because the fatality rate. And did that have to directly do with the prescribed burning, because they were more exposed?
No,
or that's just how it is.
No, so there weren't any. So when we were actually tracking the hatchlings, they didn't do any burning, so that we took the burning out of the equation altogether. But yeah, I think a lot of that's just natural mortality. They just have a really high mortality rate, those little guys. we did have some problems with the technology, the transmitters. They're so little that the range on them isn't very far. So if the animal, took off, which didn't really happen, but if it got too far outside of that range where we could detect them anymore, then we lost contact with them. And that happened a few times. But yeah, we also had an interesting, winter. I can't remember what year it was, a few years back. So box turtles are freeze tolerant to some extent, right? So they can handle our cold winters in northern Michigan. But they rely on the snow cover as sort of an insulating layer, especially the hatchlings. And so we had a winter in there that happened during this study where we had an early freeze in November with no snow cover. And so what we would typically do is put the transmitters on, and the batteries don't last very long, so we'd have to replace them occasionally. Put the transmitters on, track the hatchlings until they settled in their little soil homes for the winter, and then we'd find them again in the spring and replace the transmitter. Well, when we went back to find them all in the spring, they were all dead that year. So that freeze that year just basically killed off all of the hatchlings that were in that opening that year. So yeah, they're really, really sensitive to these changes in temperature. Now the adults would have been able to handle that because they're bigger and they can dig deeper down into the soil where it doesn't freeze so hard. But we had really high mortality that year, 100% mortality that year, that's
a big number.
I know. It's kind of
that really blows the study up.
It does, and what a bummer too to go out there in the spring and just find all of your baby turtles dead.
Yeah, that's sad. And it's actually amazing how many reptile species and amphibians can live in such cold climates and how they handle the winter.
It's incredible. Yeah.
It's real because it just freezes here. It's frozen solid for like 4 months. Like I don't even understand how anything lives. Like we still have mosquitoes. Like I think these things should be dead by now. They just wait.
I wish they were, right?
Yeah.
I know, exactly. It is. It's mind-boggling. I mean, when I worked up in Alaska, I thought about that all the time. I can't even believe any of these things are alive up here.
But those toads in Alaska, they bury pretty deep, right?
They do. And they've, those amphibians, like you take wood frogs, for example, they've evolved adaptations to dealing with those cold temperatures. And so they're able to basically freeze solid, which is not something we can do, but they have an amazing ability to withstand those winters. So
yeah, because they can actually freeze completely solid essentially, and then they just wake up in the spring.
Yeah, they just reanimate in the spring. It is wild. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I think you also have something that is on everyone else's bucket list probably, and you've done some research in the Galapagos. You already knew what I was going to say.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about what that was like, and then some of the research that you guys did there?
Sure. I mean, for biologists or animal lovers in general, I think the Galapagos is just one of those places that's totally on your bucket list, and it certainly has been on mine forever. I was lucky enough to get involved with a project that is working primarily with Galapagos lava lizards. So they're these, not the big guys, not the marine iguanas, which I'm also totally infatuated with, but the little lava lizards, which are a super interesting group of species. That each island kind of has its own species, and they all have different displays that they do to each other, and they're different coloration, and it's very island specific, right? So each species has evolved independently on those islands, and it's just a really neat system. And so we were working on various things down there just to try and understand. This is one of those species that we know very little about. So a lot of these basic natural history questions we just don't know anything about. And the other flip side of that is that they are often prey for cats on the island that don't belong there. So there's feral cats on some of these islands. And so I was really interested in, how does this cat predation, or just predation by some of the invasive animals that are there, how does that affect them? Does that does that cause changes in their morphology? So does that tend to lead to animals that are faster or, that are able to get away from these predators better? So I was kind of interested in that question. And then that spawned all sorts of things. So we've been down there collecting genetic samples and measuring lizards and finding out that they eat these crazy centipedes that are down there, those big scolopendra centipedes. They're just huge. They're, I don't even know, 10, 12 inches long. And
Ugh.
I know we had one we were processing and it regurgitated the centipede that was
no
just long. And it's just like, oh, okay, I guess you can handle that. The wildlife in the Galapagos is just absolutely incredible. It's just, it is just such a unique place, and it's just loaded with marine iguanas, and there's the birds are just fantastic, and it's just an incredible place. And I'm so lucky to be able to work down there.
It seems like almost an alternate universe.
Yes.
It's like it's its own separate thing, and everything there is just slightly different enough than everything else. We were like, what's going on here?
Yes, 100%. That's exactly what it's like. It is just the coolest place. I'm just totally, it's incredible. We had the opportunity to do some snorkeling while we were down there too. It's not all work. And they're just green sea turtles in some of the bays around there that are just, it's one of those places where, sea turtles aren't doing too well, but you go down there and you can snorkel and look out and just see, sea turtle after sea turtle after sea turtle. You can see 25 sea turtles in one pan of the water, which is just incredible. I've never experienced anything like that before.
And those sea turtles are so much bigger when you see them in person. Hey, I've done some snorkeling in Hawaii, and we did the green sea turtles, and they're like coffee tables, and you can't tell when you see pictures. They don't look that big, and you see them in person, you're like, that's literally the same size as me, basically.
They're enormous. I know. Yeah, they're huge. They're absolutely huge. Yep. And you're right. You don't appreciate it until you see them in person, and you could hear them too. They were just chomping away at the algae that's growing in the rocks, and you could hear that crunching and just look out. And yeah, you're right. They're like a little Volkswagen or something.
Yeah. So, that must be some of your top favorite field work that you've done. Other places that you've done field work? I guess New Zealand as well. That was probably... yeah.
Well, I've been really lucky to do some pretty cool projects. I worked, one of my favorites actually was really early on when I was right after I graduated from undergrad. I helped out in a project in Venezuela working with green anacondas. Infatuation with snakes, and that was just such a cool project and such a cool landscape. We worked out in the Llanos, which is this flooded savanna, and the species there are just really abundant and pretty incredible, and the snakes were huge. And and then in New Zealand is one of my absolute favorite places on the planet, and I was also lucky there to go out to some of these offshore islands where most of the native species live anymore. So New Zealand, has a lot of introduced mammals and no native mammals aside from bats. And so the native fauna have gotten hit pretty hard by a lot of these introduced mammals. And so you have to go offshore to these little island sanctuaries often to find the native stuff. And I was lucky enough to work on Stevens Island, which has really more tuatara than anywhere else on the planet. And so it was just absolutely incredible. You just sit there and there they are, just sort of hanging out next to you. And it's really indescribable.
Can you talk a little bit about what those tuataras are like? Because they are this kind of unique, and there's a lot of people that maybe aren't familiar with them as well.
Yeah, they're kind of this, they represent sort of this archaic group of reptiles that's been around for a very long time. So we used to have their ancestors spread all across the planet at one point. We know that from fossil evidence. But they are now only restricted to New Zealand, oddly enough. And they represent again, an entire order of reptiles. Okay, so what does that mean? Crocodiles and alligators are in one entire order, all of those species. All of snakes and lizards are in their entire order, right? All of the turtles and tortoises are in one other order, and then tuatara, one species in an entire order. So that just tells you how distinct they are from the rest of the reptiles. Now, if you look at them, hopefully people are Googling right now, like, what do these things look like?
Oh, they are.
Yeah. they look like a lizard. They look like an iguana, maybe. They have a row of spines down their back. They're decent size. They can be, what, I don't know. It depends on the tail, right? If you think about tail, maybe they can be 3 feet long. But they have some characteristics that other reptiles don't have that make them unique, which is why they're in their own order entirely. So, but they're just really cool animals. The fact that they're only found in New Zealand, they're really rare, and they're really a conservation focus down there. They're just this really super unique species that's been declining. And so there's been a lot of conservation efforts that have gone into restoring these populations. And so I was lucky to be involved with some translocations where we took animals, from healthy populations and established new populations in different places. And that's been a really successful technique that the New Zealanders use. And so they're doing better than they were, which is good.
So what are some of those unique characteristics that they have that separate them as a separate order?
Sure. They have, so snakes and lizards, which are their sister group, have a paired hemipenis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of your folks will be familiar with that.
Yeah.
Tuatara don't. They have no organ like that at all. So they're bird-like in that regard. So they just have a cloaca, just like birds do. They have these ribs in their abdominal wall called gastralia. That's a very sort of archaic characteristic in reptiles that's not really found in any other group. Their teeth are different. They're actually, their teeth are kind of part of their jaw instead of being embedded in sockets like other species. And their skulls are different. So there's, we characterize the morphology of vertebrate skulls based on these holes in the skull that are called fenestra, and they have a different number than all the rest of the other reptiles do. So they're just very different.
Yeah, that's so interesting, and you can kind of get that glimpse of like an older species, right?
Yes.
They haven't really changed over the time, and they have no evolutionary ancestors on the planet. It's just them.
Yep, for sure. They've been around a very long time. There's other species like that. You can talk about sturgeon or those sharks, in Greenland that live forever. Oh, and then tuatara, they live for a very long time. So they may live 100, 120 years, something like that. So they're really, really long lived. We had a couple of cases where, so the research on Stevens Island has been going on for a very long time. Lots of people involved, but it really started in the 1940s with a guy called Bill Dobbin, and he started marking animals. And back then they used to do that by toe clipping. So you would take it would be basically like if, I had my 10 fingers and then I started, this is going to sound bad, but you clip off the ends of their fingers. And
it was the 40s.
Yeah, exactly. We don't do this anymore, but you clip off the ends of the fingers in a unique code so you can identify individuals that way. And so this database, this toe clipping database, goes back to the 40s. And there were a couple of animals that we caught in, the mid to late 2000s that were marked back in 1946.
Wow.
And if you go back to this one in particular, it was just this big, healthy male. And I remember we caught this guy and said, oh, he's toe clipped. So we checked the database and found out he was first marked in 1946 as a healthy adult male then, which probably meant he was at least 20 years old then. And so, you do the math on that, and then you realize you're holding an 85-year-old animal or something. And
that is insane.
and he's in perfect condition. He isn't showing any signs of aging. It's kind of mind blowing when you realize that.
He's just hanging out on that island and the whole
Yeah.
world is evolving around him and he has no idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Yep.
We have iPhones now.
I know. I know.
It's crazy. It's crazy to think you go back there. So they obviously share a last common ancestor with the other orders, but that would be a long time before. Like they're not predecessors to the lizards and the crocs.
No, they're a sister taxa to snakes and lizards. So they split, those groups split off a long time ago, but they're still a sister taxa to the.
Do they know what that number is, or is that just we don't know how long ago those groups split?
Oh gosh, that's a question that I'd have to look up, I think. But it was a long time ago. Yeah, and way back in evolutionary history.
Yeah,
I can't pull the exact number out of my head at the moment.
Sure. Oh, that's interesting. So if there is an average person that wants to help conserve, maybe they're not involved in academics, but is there anything that the average person can do to maybe, because I think everybody that cares about animals wants to help, preserve the wildlife. So what are some things that people can do?
You can do a lot. So one thing is to go out and vote for politicians that are supporting, habitat conservation and policies that support things like that. I think that's really a huge thing, because often, we can do the research and we can come up with management objectives and recovery plans. But if we're hampered by policies that don't support things like habitat conservation, then there's really not a whole lot we can do. So that's one thing. The other thing is to, get involved with projects like HerpMapper or iNaturalist. When you're out there looking for things in nature, upload those records if you can. Those can be really useful. What else can you do?
Yeah, and for anyone that is not familiar with those two applications, I think they're both available for your phone as well, right? You can just
for sure. Yep, you can get an app, you can download it, and all you have to do is just snap a picture of the thing that you're seeing, and it'll upload your location, and it's kind of fun, actually. I mean, there's Pokemon Go became a I don't know if people are still crazy about that or not, but this is, to me, it's almost like Pokemon Go. You can you can keep track of the things that you've uploaded and the records.
It's the real Pokemon Go.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And then I guess, another thing, just talking about the hobbyists out there, is just be aware of where your pets are coming from. That the pet trade, illegal collection is still a big issue in the pet trade, I think, especially for reptiles. And so I just really advocate for people to be aware of where their animals are coming from, and to make sure that, this isn't a species that's being taken out of the wild illegally, and being sold to you, because often those, the animal's welfare is not in the best interests there, and it can really harm those wild populations. So be really, try and get as much information as you can before you buy something, I guess.
Yeah, no, and it's something that I've mentioned several times before. I think it's so important that, because you're right, you can actually find wild-caught animals fairly easily, and it is just something we don't need to be doing, because there is you can find a reputable breeder for basically any species you want to keep, for the most part.
Exactly.
And poaching is just doesn't do anybody any favors, because we will lose the animal completely.
Yep. Exactly. So do your homework.
Yeah, exactly. It might cost a little more, but it's definitely worth it.
Yep.
Cool. Well, is there any other fieldwork stories or any other bits of research that you'd love to share with us before, any interesting bits that you'd love to share before I let you go?
Oh gosh. I don't know. That's a pretty open-ended one. Yeah, we covered most of my favorite places. I think I covered most of the good ones. I think we all learned a lot today. So I really appreciate
it's great to talk to someone that's in the field doing the research. And I know being an academic is not easy because you're constantly having to publish stuff.
Yeah, although, I'm lucky at my university that I have some freedom to, really pursue projects that I'm interested in. And, my university values things, values teaching really heavily as well. And so that's a big part of my job. And so I think I'm actually pretty lucky in that respect. So I can kind of go after projects that I'm really interested in and that have a real conservation and management focus. And if it results in a publication, that's great. But if it doesn't, that's okay too. So,
because you also lecture, right?
I do. Yep, I do. Yeah. Absolutely. Yep. I teach herpetology every other year, which is just great fun. That's probably my favorite class that I teach. I usually get a really excited group of students in there, and we spend a lot of time out in the field and just learning about amphibians and reptiles, and that's super fun.
Oh, I bet that's probably everybody's listening dream course to take a course like that.
Yeah,
not every university has that as an option to take. So
no, I think if you have a herpetologist basically on your faculty, then people tend to have a herpetology class. But if not, then it's not there. So
do you guys mostly cover the native wildlife in the Michigan area?
We do. Yeah, I try and get out in the field as much as we can, and so I guess the lab portion of the course does focus mostly on Michigan species, but we cover everybody in the lecture. I mean, I teach it's sort of just a broad brush of all things herp related, but we do, the field part does focus on native species in Michigan. So,
awesome. Well, that's great. If anyone's listening who's interested in getting to academics, hopefully this kind of guided them a little bit, and they can, listening to your stories, I think everybody would want to go into academics after getting to go to some of the places you've been. And and if you're a herper and you're in the hobby, then I think hopefully covered some things that you can do to help conserve, because that's super important. And I know you're pretty active on Twitter, actually.
Yes, I am. Yes. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Reptilia. And then my website, there's a website link on Twitter as well. And you can also, you can probably find me just if you Google me and tuatara or something, or I don't know, a reptile, you'll find my website. So.
Yeah. And I'll post everything in the show notes so everybody can have access to that. And you are always tweeting interesting facts and retweeting things. So that's great.
Yeah, mostly I just tweet pictures of baby turtles and stuff. So if you like that, then you'll probably like my Twitter feed.
Yeah, well, who doesn't like that?
Exactly.
And you actually, the papers, like you don't need to have access to a university database to read your published work. Like that, most of the things are actually on there.
Yep, that's right. Yep, you can get access to most things. So if you're interested in the scientific papers, then go for it.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time today. I do really, really appreciate it. And I think everybody definitely got something out of it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, that is the end of another episode, guys. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you really enjoyed that episode. I really have to thank Dr. Moore for taking the time. I know professors and people who are doing research are typically very busy, and a lot of the times they're not super interested in having a more down-to-earth conversation with somebody who isn't on the same scientific level. But Jen was 100% willing to do this. She was actually excited about it, and I really, really appreciate it. And I hope that you got something out of that episode, whether that be downloading the iNaturalist app or a HerpMapper app to do your own, quote unquote, research out in the wilderness and start taking some pictures and documenting animals that you find. Or maybe you're a little bit younger and you still have your academic career ahead of you, and maybe this allowed you to direct that focus a little bit more into something that you think you might want to go into. Anyway, that's it for me today. So if you would like to support the show, make sure you subscribe on iTunes or subscribe on YouTube or comment and share the content. That helps me a ton. You can go buy shirts, Animals at Home shirts at animalsathome.ca/shop. $5 for every shirt does get donated to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy. And you can also go to my website and click the Buy Me a Coffee link and then donate $3 to the podcast to help me produce it.